Hello, hello, everybody. We are live with Justin Freeman. Give us a moment here. Just going to fire out a tweet. Okay, the tweet is out.
The tweet is released.
The tweet is released. We are live. I'm just going to post this here as well. Okay, cool. We're live and rolling. Justin, how are you, man?
And I'm living the dream. We just, as you obviously know, we just launched last Wednesday. So we're getting on a week old over at runthesims.com. This is kind of a long-term project. We've kind of had in the back of my mind for a little bit, and it's kind of manifesting into existence. And so it's been fun. I've been able to cross paths with some unique people over the last several months, trying to network, get this thing started. And, when I kind of got to know a little bit more about what you were doing over here at Bet the Prop, I was like, man, this is a great fit. Like, I love that you guys have a really clear understanding of, what you're good at, the markets you can beat, the markets you can't, and that sort of thing. Like that eludes a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure. I think knowing your strengths and weaknesses, and same in DFS, right? I think it's similar to having an idea of game selection, knowing where your edge is. I think that's why we've been able to be successful is being very aware of where our edge lies and not overstepping that boundary too much and staying in our lane, which is very much props and maybe going into a few other areas as well. But I mean, props are just so much fun and we have a ton of fun over here. So I was excited to speak with you a little bit because you've shown me behind the curtains a little bit. I don't know how much we can get into it here, but I know you guys seem to be taking a little bit of a different approach when it comes to projections and some of these tools. So for my audience, who's primarily about prop betting, tell us a little bit about what they can expect and why they should be excited about what you guys are bringing.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, if you're into prop betting, there's probably a pretty good chance you're into some of the other fantasy aspects as well. So our site really caters to three primary fantasy demographics: season long, daily, and then also the prop betting side. And so we're actually making some pretty cool prop betting tools like as we speak right now that'll all be up by August 15th. So plenty of time to hop in ahead of the NFL, start of the NFL season. And what we're doing is we base everything on simulations, as sort of the name indicates. Run the Sims. We run 10,000 play-by-play level simulations, which is a pretty unique approach, as far as I know, at least in this particular aspect. And so, not only are we getting sort of macro level understanding of where projections fall for players, we're drilling down deep. Essentially, like imagine you ran a Madden simulation 10,000 times and you could pull that box score at the end of every game. Like I've got that on every player and every stat category that your basic sports book's going to offer a line on. So if you get Patrick Mahomes over under 299.5 passing yards, you can key that right into our prop betting tool, and along with the juice on either side, and we'll find out whether or not there's a good bet on either side. I mean, obviously sometimes it may be like pretty much dead on. There's no value either way, but we'll be able to tell you. We're kind of implementing the Kelly criterion for betting as well there to understand exactly how much of your role you should be allocating to certain things. So pretty excited about the way things are going. The build team's been doing an excellent job, and it's a lot of fun. Everything's free right now, so you can go on over and create a free account, or we've hooked you guys up with a promo code. So if anybody's ever ready to go ahead and put 2 feet in, they can use the Bet the Prop promo code for $50 off the bundle package. Go ahead and hop on in there, and it's going to be a lot of fun, man. Really looking forward to it.
Yeah, I think our users are going to get a lot of value out of it. And the thing that sort of excited me in talking to you is the approach you guys are taking to. You mentioned the Sims and what that allows you to do is build more of a range of outcomes, which as a prop bettor, I'm very interested in, because we sort of in the prop community get stuck on this binary over or under result, which makes sense, of course, but from a probabilistic point of view, it's really not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do when it comes to props is figure out what the entire range of outcomes is, where those range of outcomes are weighted, and then sort of compare that to the line. So you showed me a graphic that does kind of exactly like that. We were basically looking at a histogram type of graph where we can see exactly where those outcomes are weighted. And I think that's a lot more informative to me anyway when it comes to props than sort of just a binary result. Is that sort of fair to say?
Yeah, exactly. And then obviously, once the ball is snapped and the bet is booked, obviously anything can happen, and you can get outlier events that exist at sort of, if we're thinking about imagining things on a bell curve type distribution, we all kind of know what those look like. Obviously, every once in a while, you're going to see something way out there on one of the tails, but for the most part, it's going to be sort of right there in the sweet spot. So if we can know exactly where that curve resides, then we can get into plus EV situations. And that's obviously super attractive, not only for sports betting, but for DFS as well. Like, and DFS adds even another layer on it that sports betting doesn't, in the peer-to-peer aspect of it. And how do you take that on top of projected ownership or those sorts of things to create leverage spots? So really it's a lot of fun digging in that. You're looking at, what is the pathway for a guy failing? What is the pathway for a guy succeeding? And whereas before we used to have to try to compute all those numbers mentally and balance them sort of like on the fly, now we get to be a bit more precise and be like, no, actually Patrick Mahomes is under 299 and a half passing yards in 58% of the simulations. Exactly. And as long as you can get a market of minus 110 or better, then you've got a good bet on the under. And so, and allows us to be price sensitive in our shopping, which is obviously going to be a big deal if you're a serious sports bettor.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Well, we're going to have plenty of time to dive into that stuff as we get into the season and everything. For today, we want to talk about some middles. And I know that's a tool that you guys have on the site is a middling calculator. And I got to say, this is probably one of the most common questions we get is this a good middle? Is that a good middle? Should I middle this? It's a prospect that's very, very enticing to people, but I don't think people really have an understanding of how to calculate them when they're plus EV, when they're not. And a lot of people just want the answer to the test. But for those that don't, you guys have some great tools. So we just published a piece on the site going through some middle spots that I found this week across various books. So why don't we just dive right in, start firing up the middle calculator at runthesims.com and start looking at a few of these spots.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we kind of designed this this tool here to not predict, but at least display the value for the 5 different outcomes that are possible for any middle opportunity. And so if anybody's coming in cold and doesn't know what a middle is, obviously we're trying to take opposite sides of the same market and try to take different lines that are available to ensure that if something happens there in between those two lines that we've secured, we're actually essentially double our money in that situation. Whereas in the same situation, if anything happens on the far ends, we're going to tend to come pretty close to breaking even, maybe lose just a smidge to the VIG. But overall, these can be some pretty attractive opportunities. But as you guys have mentioned in some of your earlier articles, keep in mind, because middles can be a little bit of a trap sometimes, because if you're taking one bet that's extremely positive EV and using a negative EV bet to middle it with, sure, you may be locking in some sort of guaranteed profit or larger multiplier type payout, but we should really never be doing any sorts of bets that are known negative EV bets, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the golden rule of middles that we'll get into a little bit with some examples. But basically, the golden rule that we're going for here is never give away your EV. So if you have a plus EV bet and say the line moves and you have that nice window to middle, even if it's a nice window, it's not necessarily a good idea to middle because that other bet might still be minus EV, possibly, not necessarily. But the idea is don't middle a plus EV bet with a minus EV bet just to middle and try to increase your payout. But these tools are going to help us to sort of calculate that. But yeah, I mean, middling is a funny thing. And especially with props specifically, it's in practice, it's something that we end up not doing very often for a number of reasons that don't necessarily have anything to do with pure EV. Prop bettors are sort of advantage bettors, and oftentimes the books sort of frown upon advantage bettors, as is probably not a surprise to my audience and maybe a surprise to yours. Books are banning people, right? They don't want winners there, at least a lot of these domestic books, and that's just the way it is. So if you're a winning bettor, chances are pretty good you're going to get limited at some point. So part of what we're trying to do is not attract attention in the meantime. So really, we only want to be taking the middle spots that are sort of absolute no-brainers. That's like, I really have no choice but to take this one and hope we're not garnering too much attention.
Yeah, exactly. It's a bit of a cat and mouse game with the books, and you're trying to stay under the radar. So I think, and you may be able to speak with more experience than I have. I don't currently live in a legal sports betting state, but if you can do these sorts of middle opportunities by combining different sports books. And I think that's usually how this presents itself. One book hangs a line really low and one book hangs a line really high, and then you can hop on either side. Does the book have as much ability to sort of correlate those things behind the scenes, or do those systems tend to not speak to one another?
Yeah, the books aren't really speaking across networks like that. So, if I place a bet at DraftKings and then I try to middle at FanDuel, that won't necessarily raise alarms on its own. The problem is with middles, in order to take advantage of them, you really need to be betting larger amounts than you normally would be. Otherwise, it's not really worthwhile, right? Like, there's not really much point in trying to middle a $50 bet. Like, we want to, in order to get the EV, we want to be risking more. And with props, you don't want to be maxing your bets all the time, because that's a good way to get attention. And that's why it's the same thing with arbiters, guys who are, kind of arbing bets across the board. They have to bet large amounts in order to realize their edge. And it's sort of the same with us with middles. So the problem is not necessarily the books talking to each other. It's just, if you're betting at your limits on a regular basis, you are going to, and you're a winning bettor, you are going to attract attention. And if you lose your outs, that's a major problem.
Yeah, and I'm hopeful that the world of prop betting may become a little bit more liquid over the next several years. And hopefully that means that the sports books become a bit more efficient in those areas and stop banning people and actually, use them as legitimate markets and not just sort of marketing arms for people to come in and bet NFL lines at -115 or whatever,
We'll see. It's going to be an interesting time. I'm not sure what the future holds, but we'll see. So, hey, let's jump into a few of these, and I've gathered a couple different lines from across books. We're looking at we've got some lines from Bet365, from Fox Bet, from DraftKings. I've written up an article here on bettheprop.com talking about some of these middles. So, why don't we just once my window unfreezes here, why don't we just dive into this? We'll take a look at some of these odds. I'll take you through the process of how we're middling some of this stuff. Most of my screen is frozen here. You're still with me, eh, Justin?
Yeah, I'm still there. So even if the screen quits on you, I won't do that. But if you can, secure, we'll talk about this first one that you've got frozen up here on the screen, which is Carson Wentz passing yards. You got Bet365 coming in at 3,900 as a available passing yards line for Wentz, and you've got Fox Bet at 3,555. And obviously, that's a pretty dramatic middle opportunity there. If my mental math is correct, that's 345 yards to land on, which is pretty unheard of. So, if you got that much space, that's essentially a full game's worth of available yardage there. And granted, you have to think about things in terms of, the stat itself, predicting passing yards can be much more variable than predicting rushing yards, for example, for a known commodity in each, because large numbers, large variance, it's going to be all kind of relative. So you also sort of have to be drawing attention to the, to the juice on either side. So to take the under on that 3,900 is -130. And so even if you love that middle, are you willing to pay -130 on the 3,900 and -110 on the 3,555? Yeah, it's 40 cents worth of juice there. That may not necessarily be a good idea, even if you know that, even if you have projections that say it's going to land in the middle,
Yeah. Well, luckily we have just such a tool to help us calculate these things. So let's try to do that. So we talked about Wentz there. Okay. So we've got 3900.5 at -110 / -130. So we've got the middling calculator here. So that's going to be our under bet because that's the higher number.
Right.
So we're going to put that in. And then on the other side, we have 3555.5. And that is, and we want to go over there. So that's -110. And we want to go under on this one. So that's -130. So we're going to put that in here. The over bet is -130. The under bet is -110. Keep it simple.
Other way around.
Other way around. Thanks.
Yeah.
And to keep things simple, let's call it $100 units. So in this case, we're going to risk $110 to win $100. In this case, we're going to risk $130 to win 100. So think of this calculation. So basically what we're doing here is the same thing we would be doing is on a straight bet where you're paying, say you're paying -110 on something. And with that -110 number, what that tells you is, okay, I have to risk $100 or $110, pardon me, to win 100. So we know our risk reward. It's a very simple calculation. What this calculator is doing is that exact same thing, just with the two things, with the two different lines. So right here, it says, okay, the middle, if we land between this margin, we win $200. If he goes under 3,555 yards, we lose $10. And if he goes over 3,901, we lose $30. So that's our risk reward. Now, where we go from there, so basically what we want to do is we want to calculate our expected value, or basically we want to calculate what is this number implying and how often this will happen. So with the -110, right? Like that's kind of the classic line. We have to beat that. I believe it's, off the top of my head, 53.8% of the time, 52.8% of the time. So we want to get that same figure from this number. And the way we do that is the same way, risk divided by reward. So our reward here is $200. Our risk for that, we're going to average the two potential outcomes if we lose. So our average risk there is -$20, right? So basically we just divide 200 by 20 and we get 10%. So that means that these lines are implying that Carson Wentz will fall within this middle window 10% of the time. So again, very simple calculation. This is our reward. We're going to average the risk and divide it into the reward. And that's going to give us a number. And you can convert that. We've got this odds calculator. And you can basically, so 10% implied odds, that's +900. So our job now as handicappers is to decide whether that is going to happen more or less often than the 10% that the book is implying. That's sort of where the art, the science, the math comes into it. And of course, that's a skill. There are different ways to do that. We can use your projections. We can use some other methods. We can use other projections. There's lots of things we can do. That's sort of the art behind it. But our job is to figure out, is that going to happen more or less than the 10% that this is implying? Does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly. And so, really think about it as like this multiplier type of bet, and are you better or worse than a 10% dog in this particular instance for it to land in that 345-yard middle? And I think that's a discussion worth having. And I think like where I would get started on my research here is maybe going back and looking at some historical quarterback numbers, and especially if you can compare it to their preseason projections, and like how big of a range are we talking? Do quarterbacks tend to be really tightly clustered to where we thought they'd be preseason, or are we typically off by like a number of 500 or more? And so, I think there's reason to say that you could justify doing this, at essentially a 9-to-1 payout. That seems reasonable to me. It's just a matter also when we have to think about these season-long props. Now we're tying up $240, 2 units worth essentially for an entire season. for something that's a 9-to-1 shot of happening. And so we have to ask ourselves, do we want to tie up our bankroll? So if you're limited by bankroll, that brings in a whole nother concern here. And if this were a weekly prop, we could go right into our prop tool and hop in and look at that. We don't have projections for season long that are simulated. We have just our baseline projections, but no simulated stuff. So otherwise we'd be able to hop in there and put a number to it. So I think, like, what's your gut instinct, Corey? Like 9-to-1 here for a Carson Wentz middle. Does that stand out to you as value?
So, I mean, to me, no. This one I would not be middling on, and in fact, very few of these I would be middling on for a number of reasons. One of which you just mentioned is the fact that you're tying up capital for 6 months for something that, at best, is probably a pretty small edge. So even if we decide, even if we know for sure that he's going to land in this range 15% of the time, which is quite a bit greater than the 10% of the time that the book is implying. Even if we know that for sure, it's still kind of questionable whether we want to tie up that kind of capital for that long, but also potentially if we're betting big enough, potentially, garner some attention from books that we don't want to be garnering. So for props, at least, these are not simple answers at all. So for this one in particular, this window, it's okay. The fact you guys have your projection at 40.58. Oh no, pardon me. You guys have your projection at 40.46. And the other projection from another site I'm seeing at 40.58. So, I think this is one where we could say, if we like it, probably more of the value is on the over. So if we decided that these projections are good, which is a totally different conversation. Projections, particularly for season long, are not perfect at all. They're a pretty tough problem. But let's say we've decided that these are good projections, and they're going to be accurate. And this about 4,000 yards is a nice median projection for Carson Wentz in the new gig there. Then basically the value's on the over 35.55, and that's where the value is. So even if there's a little bit of EV by trying to middle there, if we've agreed that these projections are good, then just take your value on the 35.55. That's where the value is. So again, this goes back to what I was talking about before. Don't give away your value. If we think this 3,900.5 is not a very good line because he's going to go over according to our median projections, then that's minus EV. So when you add these two bets together, perhaps it's plus EV altogether, but you're basically just adding a minus EV bet to a plus EV bet. And why would you do that when you can just take the plus EV bet?
Right. And you're drawing attention to yourself. So let's, and I think here it's like, there is some value in there being consensus to where the line ought to be between a couple places that you respect the opinions of. So if you've got two different projection sites that you do have some trust with, and they're both like, we actually like over both of those lines, then it's like, well, let's just take the lower one and hammer that one because we can now feel much better about that one.
Yeah. I mean, again, if we decided that's where the EV is, then just take that EV. Like, don't middle for the sake of middling. We're trying to win money here, and middles when you hit a middle, it's a lot of fun because you can win a lot of money and you feel really smart. But often what we're trying to do is just if there's an edge, just take it and move on to the next one. Speaking of which, let's move on to the next one. I noticed you had a note here next to Lamar, and that's another one we were talking about this morning. You know what? Let's talk about this rushing line because I think that's an interesting one as well. So DK has 950.5 at minus 112 aside. All right, so we're going to go under 950.5. Now risk $112 to win, or at minus 112. And then we're going to go over 850 at, this is at points bet. And the juice there is minus 125.
Yeah, and so in this one, we're getting, 100-yard landing zone there. And and for rushing yards, that's, you could maybe, like, a shortcut way would be to double or triple that number for the amount of landing zone you'd want as for passing yards. Just as a little shorthand. But so yeah, we've got 100 yards to work with, and the question is now we've got a very similar prop opportunity here, right? It's not going to cost us quite as much this time. We're talking $37 divided by 2, so $17.50 to win.
So it's costing us more, right? It's costing us more because we're paying. Oh, maybe not actually. Pardon me. Excuse me. Yeah. So it's going to be 37 into 200, which I believe is 18.5. Yeah. Pardon me.
Okay. So yeah, $18.50 into 200. So
a little bit, yeah, 10.8% implied odds there.
There you go. So now we have to ask ourselves, what do we think about that? So we kind of let's repeat this same experiment. What do the projections say? And I personally have that projection at 896. Our other source has it closer to 1,040. So we've got at least one. This is a little bit different. We've got at least one now that's within the middle. And so we have to essentially say, well, that's at least a little bit closer. We've got a lower price. We've got a projection that already lands there by itself, which might suggest that independently, I might like the under on the larger number and the over on the smaller number. And so now maybe I have two positive EV bets if I trust just mine. Now, granted, our other projection comes in north of both of those. And so, one thing to remember, especially as we're betting season-long props, is stuff happens over the course of a long season. Like, Lamar Jackson, no lock to play 17 games this season. You think just what happens if they've locked up a playoff spot by week 17 and he's resting that week? What if he injures an ankle in 1 week? Like, almost nobody makes it out, from one end to the other without missing any time, especially a guy who runs that much. So it adds a little bit of volatility, which sort of shakes things up a little bit. But yeah, overall, this is one that I am interested in middling, mostly because of the fact that I think that, especially on the minus 112 side, I feel like I'm getting it in good. I'm basically splitting that number right in half. But minus 112, I feel like I'm getting it in good. Minus 125, maybe a little bit debatable, but the fact that it is also a middle maybe makes me a bit more interested this time.
Right. But I mean, that's with this middle calculator, that's basically what we're doing. We're combining the risks, right? We're combining the risks on both these bets into one number. So I think that minus 125 is accounted for in our calculations. How I would look at this bet is, I think there's a lot of, you mentioned it, there's a lot of volatility in the NFL regardless. When it comes to QB rushing, I think that's his range of outcomes is quite wide. For the reasons you mentioned, injury alone, he's got a high end because he's a complete freak show. He's got a low end because of injuries. And he's also got a low end just because, we don't know what they're going to look like. We're sort of assuming from what they've done in the past, how they're going to run this offense, but we don't really know that because we haven't really seen in the history of football many quarterbacks run for that many yards, that many years in a row. So we kind of have to make a leap there to say, okay, we're probably going to see something we've never seen before. Well, do you want to take that leap? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But I just want to go back here because, I think the over 850.5 is probably the play here. If you had to play something, I think that's probably the play. But I do want to say that, and as my followers probably know, when it comes to these season-long props, it's basically under or nothing, in our opinion. I think we played about 30 bets last year on season-long props, and I think one of them was an over. It was literally unders across the board. And the reason is because the same reason with these projections, they're shaded a little bit high because it's sort of a best case scenario, but the best case scenario is rarely playing out in the NFL. I mean, these guys are always getting hurt. Crazy stuff happens all the time. So I think the outcomes are usually a lot worse in season long than we tend to give them credit for. And basically, if it's not an under, I'm passing. So this would be one where I might middle it. It's an okay middle, but it's basically this line is begging me to take the over, which means I'm just passing on it.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm grinning because we've got a worker, a writer for us at Run the Sims, Matt Blair at Grizzly Blair on Twitter, and we call him the Undertaker because all he does is take unders on these season-long props. Because you're exactly right that there's a lot more stuff that can go wrong than can go right when you're trying to nail down season-long props, because or when you're making season-long projections, like you're kind of projecting. You can't project the bad stuff. You got to project like the most likely good scenario for each player. It's tough to do it any other way. And so it's just sort of a natural weakness. Like if you plotted it out on a graph, it would not be a normal distribution curve. It would lean really heavy towards these unders. And so I think that's a smart thing to do. I think maybe make sure that your books are pricing in that 17th game as they're supposed to. And as long as you feel like you're getting proper credit there for that additional game, then yeah, taking the under makes so much more sense in these.
Yeah. The rule of thumb we kind of go by on those is basically, if you want to take an over, you need to be confident that is off by about 2 games.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Otherwise, if you think it's off by sort of 1 game from the average, it's probably a pass, because on average that guy's probably going to miss 2 or 3 games. So basically, to take an over, it needs to be a bad line.
Exactly, I agree.
And I think you could maybe argue that 850 is a bad line for Lamar there, but with a minus 125.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's not amazing.
Yeah, thank you. I think you sold me, honestly.
Let's look at maybe Devonte Smith as well. That's an interesting one because that's an even bigger gap. We got a 200-yard gap there. Pretty juicy on both sides. I think I ran the numbers on this, and it's about a 11.5% implied probability on that. Any thoughts on that one? Because I know projections across the board have him going over pretty easily here. I see you guys are very aggressive on.
I'm ridiculous on Devonte Smith. Like, I don't believe, honestly, in the other receivers on that team. I believe a lot in Devonte Smith. His college production profile just out of this world, phenomenal. And he'll be back with a former teammate of his and Jalen Hurts there. So excited about the narrative there. It's going to be a lot of fun. So I just think he's going to be a target monster. And I would bet on this over here. And you're getting it minus 115, not a horrible price, but I mean, like I've practically got him double that in terms of yardage. And I have a little bit of bias that's coming into that. The thing to realize about projections is I always call them subjectively objective, right? It still gives you plenty of opportunity to give a little extra love to those crushes that you just happen to have. And for me, I have a reason why I think Devonte Smith projects for 1,321 receiving yards, and it is bullish, but I want that to stand out, and it does. And so I'm for taking the over in this situation.
Yeah. I think one thing you could maybe do there is have a look at historically top 10, top 12 wide receiver picks in the draft and kind of have a look through and see how those guys have performed over the years. And then maybe also take a look at the play volume that we're expecting from Philadelphia this year. Those are some of the angles you could take in analyzing this, but I agree. I mean, 750, it seems a little bit off. And, oftentimes what we're doing as bettors is sort of taking our opinions out of it. So what I would do as a handicapper looking at this and say, okay, that's a pretty big discrepancy. And it means one of these is wrong. So I don't necessarily have to be right, but I've now identified that there is a discrepancy in the market. So now my job is to figure out which one of those is wrong. Which one of those is off.
And even if you couldn't figure that out, there is some game theory in here to say that if you simply don't know and the lines are that far apart, you should just pick one and play that. And you'll probably essentially be creating a positive environment for yourself, because now you've essentially randomized which one is the wrong line and given yourself a chance to take advantage of it.
And as you get to know these markets a little bit more, you also start to understand which books are sharp and which books are maybe not putting as many resources into their prop lines. And I can tell you from experience that Bet365, which is laying the 950 yards, they're a huge market with big liquidity. So that means that their lines, just from experience, are generally going to be more sharp than, say, smaller books like PointsBet. I really like PointsBet, but they do not have the liquidity going through them that Bet365 does. That's for sure. And liquidity is important because
Sure.
that is informing. That's a lot of there's some not so sharp money coming in, but there's a lot of sharp money coming in, and those guys are making those lines based on what money is coming in. So they kind of have an idea what money's sharp, what's not. So I would say if I was looking at two lines, one from a bigger book taking a lot of money, Bet365, and one from a smaller book not taking as much money, that's 200 yards off in 750.5. And I think you can make a pretty informed guess there to say that the 750 is probably not the best line.
Right. Exactly. No, I agree with that. I mean, have you noticed in your experience, like the difference between the two books in terms of your ability to get action down? Like, are you more likely to get limited at a smaller book like PointsBet where the markets aren't as liquid?
Well, yeah, I mean, it may not necessarily be directly correlated to the size of the book. It may just be their sort of like business policy. Like, for example, I don't want to burn any bridges here, but like DraftKings is kind of a classic example. Like, they're not a small book, but if you show, a modicum of intelligence, like, you're not lasting at DraftKings, and that's just the reality of it, unfortunately. So I don't think it's necessarily related to the size of the book, but just the business model that those guys are based on. And some of them are really into the, assessing risk business, and some of them are not so much into the assessing risk business. And they're just basically, if you show that you pose a risk to their bottom line, instead of using that information, which, sharp books like Bet365 will do, they'll just cut you off.
Right.
So it's really more comes down to what their business model is and what they're trying to accomplish in the grand scheme of things.
Understandable.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, looking at this board, nothing's really jumping out to me. Metcalf is another one. I think Metcalf's interesting because I think, would you agree, he's got a fairly tight range of outcomes?
Well, the thing, it's kind of like Lamar, the point you made about his rushing and the fact that like Metcalf's a freak. 100 yards is like possibly a play. Like, did he have that extra, 75-yard bomb in week 7 or not? Like it could be something that small, one single play that could swing his. So he's going to tend to be, I would think he's going to tend to be a little bit more all over the place. Now, good thing is like law of large numbers is if you have enough chances at freak opportunities, they will eventually start to normalize. Whether or not you can get there in a 17-game NFL season, up for debate. So if we're looking at this one, 1190 and 1350 is our range there. So 160 yards to play with there. That's not terrible. That's more than a game's worth of expectation from DK Metcalf, and probably closer to the 2-game rule that you had mentioned earlier. 160 yards, pretty close. So minus 110 each way. This isn't a terrible opportunity. And again, let's look at the projections. I've got it in that middle. Our other source has it outside of that middle. So I'd love it to be unanimous there, and that might actually make a lot of sense for us.
Yeah, I think it's okay. I think it's not bad. I included this one because I think it's more, we can use it as a point to illustrate, like I'm basically sitting here saying, don't bet this, don't bet that. And to be honest, that's what advantage bettors are doing, is just passing on the majority of the stuff. But I do want to mention that what this looks like more in practice. So I think Metcalf's a good example of what this might look like in practice. So say we like the over there. So you have them projected for 1223. So say I like that line and I take the line at PointsBet. I'm going to take over 1,190.5 yards for minus 110. I like that bet. So now we get into training camp and Tyler Lockett gets hurt, right? Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, that line, let's say that line all of a sudden goes up to 1,450.5 yards. Now that's a different story. And that's in practice, that's really what middling looks like. It's more taking an early line with the expectation that that's a bad line and it's going to move, or maybe you're just something falls into your lap, like a Tyler Lockett injury, or the other thing, or maybe Russell Wilson gets hurt, and all of a sudden, Metcalf has a backup quarterback throwing to him, and his projection goes down 200 yards. Those are the scenarios that we're really looking for as middle bettors. Is where either a line comes out early that is going to change for whatever reason or another, and that's pretty common during the week. I would say week to week, you get a lot of scenarios where an offshore that takes big limits will open something on a Wednesday night, and you look at it and it's wrong. You don't know if he's going to hit or not, but it's wrong. You don't know if you really want to play it, but you're like, okay, that's going to move. Whether or not I agree that it should, I know that's going to move because I saw this before in this market. So you just take that with the intention of middling later on a line Sunday morning by the time that's moved. In practice, that's really what middling is more about rather than doing this. I mean, there's some decent spots here that I think are okay if you don't mind tying up the capital. But yeah, I just wanted to point out that in practice, it really is more about getting an early bet. The information changes, and now we have a plus EV bet on both sides.
That's right. Yeah, middling to changing information, much different. And also middling for these season-long props, as we've said a couple times now, very different than doing the same thing on a weekly level. If the same same opportunity where you could take DK Metcalf over 60 yards at one book and under 90 yards at another book, now we're not tying up money for 6 months. We're tying up money for 6 hours, and we'll get that money back. And that makes a lot of sense to do. So, yeah, I think a lot of factors for us to consider here, but definitely agree that the changing of information is what can make a middle truly valuable. And we always just want to ask ourselves, do we feel like this new bet that we want to make is also plus EV? Because it's, taking that negative EV, sure, it can make you feel really secure, right? Because now you've guaranteed a no loss situation or close to it. But, we need to be taking as many plus EV swings at the ball as we can in order for, a long-term profitability to work out.
Yeah. Don't give away your edge. I think that's the best kind of heuristic to stick with in your mind. If you have an edge and you've got that locked in, don't give it away with a minus EV bet. And I think that's, if you remember that, you'll probably do well. That's a good sort of baseline to stick with.
Yeah.
Cool, man. Well, look, I'm really excited to see what you guys have going on. I'm excited to get my hands on these tools. When can people expect to see, some of these more tools come online? I know you guys got some free stuff up now. I know you got some more stuff in the works. When can people expect to see some of these more cool tools come online?
Yeah, so we're setting August 15th as our line in the sand. We want to be able to unveil our full suite of products and everything. There is so much already that you can play with. And honestly, if you're into season-long props, use the projection builder. It's free. All you need is a free account so that we can save your changes. Go in there and check that out. And you can literally tweak the market shares on any player on any team. If you think the Lions are just going to be the most run-heavy team in the NFL history, go in there and set their rush rate from, what do we have it there? 47%, set it up to 55 and see what that does to DeAndre Swift when you do that, So, look, what happened to Swift there? What up to RB14 there? So, yeah, you can do all kinds of cool stuff and everything updates there in real time. You can save your results and download. You can get rankings by position for your season-long drafts. And what you'll have our sort of default stuff in there and go in there and tweak literally anything. If you want to make a stand on the Chicago quarterback rotation and set Justin Fields as starter all year long, by all means, go in there and take care of that. But yeah, it should be fun. Hope everybody enjoys playing around in there. Get your free account now. We do have a promo going through the end of the month called our Founders Club, where we'll honor the price that you lock in for life. As long as we own this company, we'll honor the $199 price for an NFL season, which you can get. Go to the bundle package on our subscription page, use code BetTheProp, and you'll get $50 off. So you'll get that for $199.
Yeah, I don't think people realize what a ridiculous offer that is. Not the Bet the Prop promo code, but the lock in the price for life. I remember thinking about doing that with my site in the beginning, and people told me I should like never ever do that, just giving away too much value. So I would jump on that if I were out there considering.
Minus EV from me, man.
yeah. But the Goodwill EV, you can't put a price on that, right?
That's right. Be one
Awesome,
of the first
man.
folks, man.
Well, look, man, I'm really excited to see what's coming. I'm looking forward to seeing the tools, putting them to use to make a little bit more money for our subscribers, and hopefully looking forward to doing a little bit more streaming with you in the future, Justin.
Yeah, it's been fun, man. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, and again, sign up at runthesims.com, use promo code BetTheProp, and check out the free tools. And when you're ready to dive in, take a dive in. And Justin, it was great talking to you, man.
Same to you. See you, Corey.
Okay, cheers.